Hello, welcome to this video on clause 8.3 of ISO 9001 Design and Development. Before we look at the criteria in the clauses themselves, I just want to take a note on two items. Firstly, on exclusions. In older versions of the ISO 9001 standard, it was permissible to claim exclusions at the start of an audit, and an auditor would accept them readily if there was no obvious need to look at particularly design and development, which was then in clause 7 of the old 2008 version of ISO 9001. With the new version of the standard, the mechanism for claiming exclusions was removed, and in fact, all clauses of the standard must be applied where there's no justification for excluding it. So the only real area companies in recent years have been acceptably claiming exclusions is from clause 8.3, design and development of products and services. But the organization has to be able to substantiate the claim for excluding it. In other words, they can't have any design and development activities within the business that matter, that are significant to the business. And excluding design and development can't have any impact on the remainder of the management system. So with that in mind, in this first part, I also wanted to, instead of just diving straight into the criteria of the clauses, I wanted to look at the clause structure for the subclauses, because it's important to note a couple of things here. Part 1, general. Part 2, design and development planning. We just highlighted here. Design and development inputs, design and development controls, outputs, and changes. I think the main point I want to make just here before we look at the clauses is that most organizations who would have design and development as part of their service offering, printers, architects, engineers, software engineers, all you guys operate to codes of practice, I suppose. And it's worth noting that before we proceed, because the requirement of the standard isn't that you make the standard fit your business. It's really, we're not trying to prescribe anything that you adopt unless there's a gap, unless there's a need to put some fundamental element in place. So we're not trying to change what you do already to meet your RIAI, Architecture Engineers Ireland, expected print design and development processes, software engineering codes of practice like Agile, Iterative, Waterfall, and so on. I think the point here is, the code of practice you already employ will probably be satisfactory. We just have to figure out how to plug those elements into the standards in response to the criteria. So with that in mind, we'll take a quick pause and move on to look at the clauses of the standard themselves. Okay, just to note, we're on clause 8.3, design and development of products and services. The first set of criteria is 8.3.1, which is relatively generally, but makes a statement to what we were just saying a moment ago. The organization shall establish, implement, and maintain a design and development process that is appropriate to ensure the subsequent provision of products and services. We're immediately required to have a process, a code of practice, an established set of criteria, however you want to describe it. It's kind of, you can understand the implication that really it's up to you, the organization, to put forward your own code of practice. And that may be by industry expectations, training, and so on, standard practices in your sector. Design and development planning. I'm not going to go into all the detail, it's not really the purpose of a short video clip like this. Line by line, all of this, the criteria will make sense to you as a design professional. So consider the important things here. The overall approach is there is a set of requirements of design that's probably already stated in drawings, in design specifications. in the analysis and framework provided by subject matter experts and stakeholder interests. So what the criteria of this part of the standard is looking for you to make sure that all of that information and all of those requirements are included in your planning elements of your process. So it's straightforward enough. There's no particular thing that should stand out. As per all ISO requirements, the last one is important, documented information to demonstrate that design and development requirements have been met. So you need to be able to support your claims for meeting these specifications. Design and development inputs. So we're still at the planning stage, if you like, and we're getting all of the elements that we need as inputs into the design and development process together. And it's, again, don't want to go into the criteria in detail, but importantly, once you look at the basic requirements, you then have to consider statutory and regulatory requirements in point C. Note, my colleague Vincent has made previous videos where the differentiation between statutory and regulatory requirements is made, but they are different. Just to note that statutory is something that's provided for by government, usually by a statutory instrument. It may be that that statutory instrument puts in place a regulatory authority, and that authority then will set out regulatory requirements. So think of those operating in under RAAI and under INAB for auditors, for example. We have a regulatory authority that's set up by statutory instrument, and you've got to think as well of design and development where it relates to security provisions under PSA, Private Security Authority obligations. So there are all kinds of statutory and regulatory requirements that govern design and development because of the governing body that manages the discipline for your practice in the jurisdiction we're in. So I think that's fairly clear and should be straightforward to most of you design professionals. Standard codes or codes of practice that the organization has committed to implement, well, that in itself is an input into the process. And I think the expectation of an auditor is that design and development process will be replicable and you will benchmark yourself against that process. Conflicting design and development inputs shall be resolved. I think really it's just the nature of the game in design. You can't have any conflict prior to going ahead. You've got to have everything, all of those inputs have to be ironed out. So for example, if there's a requirement for a particular specification, let's say for a material to be used, well, it would be quite acceptable to use a different material so long as you could show that appropriate measures have been taken to validate the alternative material. So it might be that something is very similar in purpose, in specification, but might have a different name or come from a different manufacturer. So those kind of conflicts need to be agreed and signed off before you move on. Excuse me. Design and development controls. I suppose as part of the planning and input process, you will be considering what controls need to be put in place to manage the design and development activity. So regardless of the discipline you come from, your design and development process will include revisions, project management meetings, site meetings, and so on, to consider progress and where you are and keeping that one eye on the design specification. So it's important that you go through the criteria here and make sure that you have your way of responding to an auditor's query with regard to each of these bullet points. I'm not kind of, too obsessed with how an organization goes about this, but I think the important thing about these reviews is there's a couple of purposes that need to be clarified, and that they're at points C and D of clause 834. So let's just look at those. Verification activities are conducted to ensure that design and development outputs meet the input requirements. And then at D, validation activities are conducted to ensure that the results the resulting products and services meet the requirements for the specified application or intended use. So again, your design and development control will include those interim tests that you need at each stage to make sure that what it is you're working on now will be suitable and effective for the next phase, and so on. And ultimately, the difference between verification and validation, I suppose the verification is in the lab, so to speak, during the design and development moment. Validation is once you're sure that the element of that design, the specification has been met, that you put it to test before moving on, because that might affect the outcome of the subsequent design processes. So I'd like to kind of move on from there, but that should be straightforward to most design professionals. Design and development outputs and changes, just taken together. I think firstly, the outputs should be specified. There should be very clear expectations in the specification for what the output of design and development should be. So we could be looking at, in product development, you could be looking at something that has a very specific requirement as an input into another process. And that's important to consider, because you could be creating a design for a machine part in a precision engineering, working with stainless steel or some other material, where you're making a part for a machine going into a very technical, very precise engineering and manufacturing process. So for example, medical device sector, pharmaceutical sector, aerospace, automotive, precision electronics, all these micro businesses that are making these internet and IT equipment. So all of the servers and routers and telecoms equipment that's programmed and the chips made for here in Ireland, particularly in Leixlip, where you've got the Intel plants. Design and development in that environment would be very precise, and controls and over how you manage changes through the design and development process, they would have to be very clear and understood across the organization, because design can often be cutting edge, if you like. So it could be that you're testing new waters and being asked to design elements of products and services where you're moving into areas, things that just haven't been done before. So the design intent, the purpose of the design may not always be achievable. So we always have to keep that in mind, and keeping stakeholders on board throughout the design and development process to make sure that their voice is heard. The one thing about changes from an auditor's perspective is, where there are design and development changes, they are going to look for that input from stakeholders, for particularly, depends on the complexity and the authority of the person who identifies the change, whether they have the authority to move on and to sign off on changes themselves, or whether they need to take it to a higher level, because the impact of the change could be potentially, I'm looking at the last two words of the criteria, adverse impacts. So what we're looking to do is to make sure that we're always keeping an eye on the design specification, the requirements of the customer, internal or external. Okay, so I'd like to finish up at that, but remind you that, first of all, design and development clause 8.3 doesn't only apply to those organizations who see themselves as being design professionals. I think you have to consider, in a lot of organizations like our own, the obvious would be for us to claim an exclusion to the clause, because we don't really offer design and development as a service, right? But we have to also consider that most of our project work particularly would be very bespoke, because we may have a standard to work toward. We may have a system model using spreadsheets and interlinking different elements of our total management system to meet the criteria of the standard. But that's in the generic format. When we're taking on a project with a customer, we have to go through a design and development process to tailor the project specification to the needs of that client. So while we could probably satisfactorily justify an exclusion to clause 8.3 because of the nature of our work, I think in reality, if we were to use clause 8.3 to govern our development of bespoke projects to our clients, well, that would provide a framework for us to make sure that that's governed well. So it's just an interesting way of looking at this. If it's possible for you to apply clause 8.3, our recommendation is that you go through that process and use the framework provided. And that way you're able to demonstrate to the auditor that you've actually made every attempt that you can to apply it. And it's only where you can't, then you can justifiably exclude it. So I think that's more than ample for now. I'd like to finish, but keep in mind that any queries you have about design and development, and about whether you could benefit from making it applicable, or whether you can justifiably exclude it, please get in touch by email or through the chat box on the website. Take care.